The people of Tibet, like their leader, the Dalai Lama, are well known as peace-loving, non-violent followers of Buddhism. What is less known is that thousands of Tibetans fought a long and bloody guerrilla war against the invading forces of communist China.
My father would tell us, the communist Chinese are enemies of Buddhism. So since they were enemies of Buddhism, we never felt it was a sin to kill them. In fact, we were happy to kill as many as we could. When we kill an animal, we say a prayer, but when we kill the Chinese, no prayer came to our lips.
These men are the forgotten survivors of the Tibetan resistance that from 1956 to 1974 took up arms against the Chinese. For much of this period, their closest ally was the CIA, which helped to train and arm them. The CIA codenamed this secret operation ST Circus.
Good morning. Good morning. How are you?
Candid camera. Hello, Doug. Good to see you.
More than 30 years ago, these now retired CIA officers ran ST Circus and worked closely with members of the Tibetan resistance. Their memories of that time, of the cause and the people they once supported have never left them.
That's fine.
Well, remember, we used to comment back and forth that we were grateful that we were working with the Tibetans instead of the group involved down in the Central America problem with the Bay of Pigs, that we were fortunate to be involved in a good program.
They are such an incredibly unique people. I don't think, even ourselves, even within the agency and perhaps not even within our own group, do we realize just how incredibly unique they are.
They still believe their religion.
Oh, yeah. But I've never met any people like them. I never will.
In late 1949, shortly after the communist takeover of China, the People's Liberation Army invaded Tibet. Tibet's tiny army was quickly defeated, and by the summer of 1951, Chinese troops were marching into the Tibetan capital, Lhasa. The 17-year-old Dalai Lama, Tibet's temporal and spiritual leader, was forced to come to terms with the Chinese. Throughout the 50s, Chinese troops poured into Tibet. In Lhasa, the Tibetan government maintained an uneasy coexistence with the Chinese. But in the outlying provinces, the Chinese began to impose communist reforms. In 1956, they began the destruction of monasteries in eastern Tibet.
The communists were teaching the common people that the lamas of Tibet were their enemies. They were bandits, and monks were thieves. I was convinced that they were planning to destroy all the lamas and monks of Tibet. So by opposing them, and in the process whether I died a violent death or a non-violent one, anyway, one has to die. I felt that it would be more worthwhile to make the supreme sacrifice and give up my life.
Although basically it's a Buddhist belief, if motivation is good and the goal is good, then method, even if they appearingly violent kind, is permissible, could be possible. But then in our situation, in our case, So whether it is practical or not. That's the, I think, big question.
The attack on their monasteries proved to be the last straw. Khamba tribesmen in eastern Tibet revolted. News of the rebellion spread to Lhasa, where a group of Khamba traders formed an underground organization. Representatives were sent to India to muster support from outside countries. In India, the Dalai Lama's elder brother, who was living in exile, came to see them.
He told us that he was happy that we had made it to India. He said he had heard of our resistance efforts in eastern Tibet and that we had come to India because we were trying to do something for our country. He said, I'm in touch with America and I will talk to them about this.
They start sending their messengers, and what they're asking arms, and I don't have arms. But then I introduced what you call Americans through the direct contact with the Tibetans, and then come in this what you call so-called American participating, training, and recruiting, and sending the Tibetans to the United States for training and this and that. Started like that way.
In 1956, the year the CIA got actively involved in Tibet, America's fears about an international communist conspiracy were at their height.
We are united in detesting communist slavery. We know that the cost of freedom is high, but we are determined to preserve our freedom no matter what the cost.
There was this whole sense that the Cold War had come to Asia, and that the fear that, which had concentrated obviously primarily on Europe prior to that time, now was this idea that communism was monolithic, communism was working together, that the aggression had to be stopped someplace, and that wherever you could do something to stop the Chinese, it had to be done.
In order to explore what the CIA could do in Tibet, 6 men were selected from the Khamba group that had come from Lhasa and secretly flown to the Pacific island of Saipan.
I was in Saipan in early '57 when we got the cable from headquarters from Washington, which said that indeed there was going to be a Tibetan group coming to Saipan for training, without too much more information other than that they wanted across-the-board training, and that the people in the group were supposed to be able to communicate once they went back into Tibet, which meant, of course, clandestine radio.
Atar Norbu is the only surviving member of that test group.
Mac would come from outside the camp wearing a military uniform, and he would teach us map reading, detonating explosives, operating big guns, laying mines, throwing hand grenades, anything to do with combat. It was Mac and his group who taught us everything. And the way they trained us was very thorough. It wasn't like they were doing it out of a sense of duty. They were genuinely trying to help us. They really taught us well. And we used to like him as well. He was like a Khamba.
After nearly 5 months of training, Atar and his partner were dropped near Lhasa with radio equipment, the first men ever to be parachuted into Tibet. Their survival and their ability to make contact with the resistance and report back to the CIA would determine the next stage of America's involvement in Tibet.
Then we got ready. The river Brahmaputra appeared below us. We could see it gleaming in the dark. There were no clouds. It was a clear night. A feeling of happiness surged through me when I realized that we might make the jump. The plane descended, and at the signal go, we went rattling out of the plane.
This is where it came. Yeah, you could have heard the cheers from one end to the other when that first message arrived in that the guys had arrived and they were safe. Yeah, that was indeed a time for celebration. And it was, it's a pretty incredible achievement to think of. Here you are, 15,000 miles away, message going out, guy sitting over there with a hand crank generator spinning this stuff out. We knew the answer, getting the answers to our questions right away.
The two-man radio team made contact with the resistance in Lhasa. Here, the Dalai Lama's government and the occupying Chinese forces still maintained their uneasy alliance. 8 months later, in the summer of 1958, the resistance moved out of Lhasa and set up a military base in southern Tibet. The radio team went with them. More than 5,000 men gathered here, and a series of attacks was launched against the Chinese. The two men radioed the success of the guerrilla campaign to the CIA, who then made the decision to step up its support. They made their first arms drop to the resistance. In late 1958, the CIA decided to train more Tibetans, and a top-secret training facility was created in the Colorado Rocky Mountains.
This whole area here is Camp Hale, this whole area, up and down the valley here. That's the area in which we trained the Tibetans. We thought that the conditions up at Camp Hale somewhat duplicated the conditions in Tibet. Mountainous terrain, the temperatures, and the climates. The Tibetans were brought up here in buses, and they were trekked into this area here, which was all cordoned off, this from mountain to mountain. That was patrolled by military police. The training area consisted of a series of Quonset huts in which the men lived, and we had a recreational area where we able to give them some recreation, and we had classrooms and so on and so forth. And of course, in connection with the training, we would make overnight trips up into the mountains to teach them hit-and-run type tactics, guerrilla type tactics, if you will.
Over the next 5 years, 259 Tibetans were to be trained at Camp Hale.
We loved American things. And the Chinese always called the Americans imperialists and the enemy of the world. So it was obvious they really hated them. So we had great expectations when we went to America. We thought perhaps they would even give us an atom bomb to take back with us. That was our hope. Because we wanted to fight the Chinese, we were ready to die. That's all we could think of.
It was unique in the sense we were working directly with people who believed very much in their own cause. And that, I think, gave it a rather unique quality. It was a thing that certainly had caused the tremendous rapport. And I just got hooked on these people. They were great. And then I started learning about their cause. And it seemed to be something that I would like to lend myself to and could certainly do with wholeheartedly.
We had this group and we trained them, and the people who did the training, of course, fell in love with them. From an emotional point of view, quite apart from national interest and pragmatic situation, all that, we felt so strongly about the Tibetans themselves and the Tibetan cause that if we could roll the clock back to the time when they were truly independent, we'd love to do that.
During the training period, we learned that, the objective of training was to gain our independence for the struggle for Tibet. The idea was, all of us was gradually go back to Tibet, down there, and organize a resistance movement, organized way, not in and out, so that we can, pressurize the Chinese gradually, force them to leave our country. That was the main objective. In our games room, we had a picture of Eisenhower, signed by Eisenhower to my fellow Tibetan friends from Eisenhower. So, that. So, during Eisenhower's period. So it was, we thought it's, even from the Eisenhower himself is giving us a support.
Although the trainees at Camp Hale believed that they were being readied for the struggle to regain Tibet's independence, this was never the official American policy.
I think basically the whole idea was to keep the Chinese occupied somehow, keep them annoyed, keep them disturbed. Nobody wanted to go to war over Tibet. That's pretty clear. We didn't go to war over Korea, and we didn't go to war over Indochina. We weren't going to go to war over Tibet. And so it was a nuisance operation, basically nothing more. And I would think that from the American point of view, it wasn't going to cost us very much, either money or manpower. Anyway, it wasn't our manpower involved, it was the Tibetan manpower. And we would be willing to help the Tibetans become a running sore and a nuisance to the Chinese.
The anecdote I like to tell about Alan Dulles was the fact that they asked me to go up to the director's office and brief him on what was going on in Tibet. He says, now, where is Tibet? We stand up on the leather couch in his office, and he has a National Geographic world map up there, and he's pointing to Hungary, and he thinks, is that Tibet? I said, no, sir, it's over here where the Himalayas, and
really cool.
By March 1959, the situation in Tibet was coming to a head. In Lhasa, news spread that the Dalai Lama had been invited to the local Chinese military camp to attend a theatrical show. He was to come alone, without his bodyguards. The people of Lhasa gathered outside the Dalai Lama's summer palace, determined to protect him. Meanwhile, the resistance was in control of a large swathe of southern Tibet. The CIA made a second arms drop.
Around that time, we received a letter from Lhasa, from the Dalai Lama's Lord Chamberlain. The letter said that His Holiness was ready to leave, and that if he didn't leave soon, the situation was becoming desperate. The two of us were told to come as soon as possible to a place near Lhasa, and we were also instructed to send this information to America.
2 days after the Lhasa uprising, the Dalai Lama, disguised as a soldier, escaped from his palace. These pictures show the Dalai Lama and his entourage, escorted by resistance fighters, making their way south into guerrilla-held territory, where they hope to set up temporary headquarters. The radio team met up with the escape party.
About every 24 hours, they would send us a message giving us their location, and we were able to take that material and then feed it into the intelligence bulletins that were kept the senior officials in the government informed as to the location, the actual location of the Dalai Lama on his escape. And so this had gone on for better part of a week.
Then finally the cabinet came to the decision that His Holiness and his entourage should cross the border into India. I was told to transmit a message to America, asking them to request the Indian government to allow the party to enter India. I dashed back. There was no question of sleeping. We lit a lamp, wrote out the message, and transmitted it.
It was a Saturday night, and I got a call from the office that a message had come in, which was unusual. The Dalai Lama was asking for asylum. Well, this was a critical piece of information, and it had to be handled very quickly. And so I took that message and went down to my office, and it was after midnight at that time, and I called my boss and told him what it was, and he said, well, go ahead and send a message to India and to Delhi and let them proceed with what they can do. So I did that, and it was on the wire in less than an hour, and I came home, and about 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning, I got a message that the answer was back and that Mr. Nehru had approved the asylum.
After a 19-day trek across the mountains, the Dalai Lama finally crossed the border into India on the 31st of March, 1959.
The Dalai Lama's decision to flee was his. He didn't team up with any of the people that we knew until 2 or 3 days en route, where one of the teams that had been dropped in before, one of the radio teams, then joined the escape party, and then were able to keep the American government informed as he went along in his progress. So in that sense, it was another intelligence coup on the part of the minor one. I mean, we knew something the rest of the world didn't.
The Dalai Lama's escape sparked an exodus of refugees as tens of thousands of Tibetans followed him into exile. The guerrillas in southern Tibet suffered major setbacks as the Chinese went on the offensive, and before long the majority had fled to India. However, small pockets of armed resistance continued in other parts of the country. Between 1959 and 1960, the CIA parachuted 4 groups of Camp Hale trainees inside Tibet to make contact with the remaining resistance groups. One of the trainees on the first mission was Baba Lekshe.
When we were dropped inside Tibet, we were told that there were many resistance fighters there. Our job was to lead these fighters against the Chinese. But when we were dropped at this place, there was not a single person there. No preparations had been made. 9 of us were dropped in the middle of 1,000 Chinese soldiers, like throwing meat into the mouth of a tiger. But thanks to the Buddha, even if we were to die, our spirits were high. We didn't feel depressed. We had made up our mind to die. We had been given cyanide capsules so that we wouldn't be caught alive by the Chinese. I still have it somewhere.
In the autumn of 1959, the CIA parachuted a second group of 16 men at Pemba, a desolate region northeast of Lhasa, where thousands of resistance fighters had gathered. One of the fighters on the ground was De Chen, who met the Camp Hale trainees soon after their drop.
They told us that aeroplanes would be dropping us weapons and that we didn't have to worry at all. They said that within 2 or 3 months we would recapture Lhasa and that the Tibetans who had fled to India would also return with more weapons. So we were very happy. Eventually the aeroplanes did come and dropped more than 800 weapons, and these were distributed among the men.
We were getting messages to the effect that we are as determined as ever to resist, but we cannot do it without significant inputs of troops and weapons, and basically they wanted us, I suppose, to come to their aid with an army. Ideally, that was never in the cards, and I think their disappointment was shared, obviously, by us, simply because we knew it wasn't possible, and we understood at the same time that that was their last hope. That's what they thought was their last hope of becoming free of the Chinese.
Then one day, the Chinese surrounded us. A Chinese aeroplane came in the morning and dropped leaflets which told us to surrender and warned us not to listen to the imperialist Americans because nothing good would come of it. After that, every day, some 15 jets came. They came in the morning, at midday, and at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They came in groups of 5. Each jet carried 15 to 20 bombs. We were in the high plains. There was nowhere to hide. The 5 jets made quick rounds and killed animals and men. We suffered huge casualties.
We knew from overflight information that monitoring Chinese air flights that they had discovered Pembar. And the sad story is that very few chose to go and leave, and understandably so, and indeed that group came under merciless attack by reinforcements. The Chinese came in with long-range artillery, they came in with aircraft, they bombed, and they captured thousands, or I think the more accurate statement is that they killed thousands and thousands and thousands and captured maybe a few hundred.
Dechen was one of the few that survived the carnage at Pembar. He now lives in exile in India. In January 1960, the CIA parachuted the fourth and last team into Tibet. Pu Sung was the only survivor of that mission. His team met up with a small guerrilla force. After several days of running battles with Chinese soldiers, they were surrounded.
Then the whole mountainside was swarming with Chinese. We fought them 9 times. We suffered our heaviest casualties that day. We fought them from 6 in the morning until noon. During the battle, the Chinese would shout out to us, "Surrender! Surrender!" We shouted back, "Eat shit!" I swear we said, "Eat shit! You invaded our country. What do you mean by surrender?" We shot at them instead. We really fought. It was intense. It was like a dream. It didn't seem real. And then at around 10 o'clock, 2 men from our team had taken their cyanide capsules and were dead. It was the end. The Chinese knew everything. So I put the capsule in my mouth, because later I might not get the time.
Before he could bite into his capsule, Pu Sung was knocked unconscious. He was in prison in Tibet for nearly 20 years. Following his release in 1980, he was able to escape to India.
Well, the other sad part of that is no one had an accurate read on Tibet in those early years. There was a golden opportunity there at one time, and I honestly believe that it would have changed, could have changed considerably. But the Chinese did the smartest thing. When they first came in, the first thing they did was build the roads. Build the roads. What was that for? Not for anything except to be able to get the troops in there. It was never expected they were going to come in the numbers that they did. And that was a poor reading on, I don't know, our part, somebody else's part.
Our intelligence was not that good.
It was almost non-existent.
While the parachute missions were taking place, the CIA agreed to support the exiled Tibetan resistance in a new operation. The plan was to send small groups of men secretly into Nepal and from there into Tibet, where they would set up guerrilla units. Mustang, a remote corner of Nepal that juts into Tibet, was chosen as the base.
The idea was it was going to be kept a secret operation too. In many ways, that was foolhardy. It's hard to keep a secret in India. It's hard to keep a secret among anybody. The word got out, and instead of the lovely controlled movement of 200 or 300 people, a couple thousand moved over there and suddenly moved over into Mustang, and we were confronted with a ready-made base and a ready-made problem.
The CIA was forced to change its plans. It agreed to support a 2,000-strong military base in Mustang itself. In the autumn of 1960, almost a year after the initial group had arrived in Mustang, the CIA made its first arms drop. 4 Camp Hale trainees were also parachuted in, and about 20 more came overland. Training began in earnest, and the guerrillas were organized along the lines of a modern army. From now on, the Mustang Resistance Force would be funded by the CIA. The commander of Mustang was Baba Yishi, a former monk and resistance leader.
We should have been happy to receive the arms, but in fact I was sad. As soon as we received the aid, the Americans started scolding us like children. They told us that we had to go into Tibet immediately. Although we were able to get a lot of intelligence, the Americans wouldn't believe us. They told us that it was useless. They needed proof. If we killed any Chinese, we had to send them their identification numbers. And if we destroyed vehicles, they wanted their registration numbers. They told us our information was useless without evidence. They really scolded us, my word. Sometimes I wish they hadn't sent us the arms at all.
Responding to the CIA's urgent demands to see results, the Mustang guerrillas set out on cross-border raids into Tibet. Their main target was the Xinjiang-Tibet Highway, one of the key supply routes from China into Tibet. In late 1961, a raiding party from Mustang on a routine mission inside Tibet ambushed and destroyed what appeared to be a small but typical military convoy.
There was 40 horsemen in our group. 5 men waited with the horses behind the mountain pass. The rest of us hid alongside the road. The men further down the line were ordered not to fire until the signal was given. The convoy was getting real close. The first truck was as close as that door there. I told our leader, "They're right next to us." But he told me to wait a minute. I said, "Why wait? We'll lose it." So I fired. The driver was shot in the eyes. His brain splattered behind him, and the truck came to a stop. The engine was still running. Then all of us opened fire. There was one soldier hiding under the truck. There was also a woman and one very high-ranking officer and a blue sack full of documents. This was carefully collected by our leader and taken back. Later, we heard that this raid was a major success, but we still don't know why.
Among the convoy's baggage, in effect, they found some very fascinating Chinese government documents, which the Tibetan resistance brought out and gave to our people, and we made it available to the U.S. intelligence community, and they were absolutely gone, berserk, really, with this wonderful material, because it's one of the few times we had some real, honest-to-goodness Chinese government official documents, and they weren't made up for us or anything like that. They weren't forgeries. And it showed that the Chinese communists were having trouble with their Great Leap Forward, and was having trouble with other parts of China, not just in Tibet. And it gave a very good insight as to what was going on inside of China. For the first time, we had some real good, hard evidence.
The Tibetan document raid was one of the greatest intelligence hauls in the history of the agency. Here was sort of, in a way, well, it's a terrible, you evaluate human lives in terms of return, but here was an actual a product of these operations that could be shown, a demonstrable one, a benefit to the U.S. government. So that was of great help as far as maintaining support for these kind of operations.
The CIA made 2 more arms drops to the Mustang force, the last in May 1965. But by this time, they were also sending messages ordering the guerrillas not to attack Chinese targets. Instead, they were to limit their operations to intelligence gathering.
They told us we had not established an army inside Tibet, and so if we fought the Chinese, they would destroy us. They told us to gather intelligence, but we didn't listen to them. Whenever we got the opportunity, We destroyed Chinese targets. We told the Americans that we had stopped making raids because we couldn't openly disagree with them. But we couldn't just let our soldiers stay there without doing anything. So every winter, we let small groups go on raiding missions until finally, the Chinese were not able to use the Xinjiang-Tibet highway at all. Not one vehicle was able to go on it.
One such raid was captured on film. Tendar led the attack.
We were right next to the highway. Suddenly, we heard the sound of trucks. I fired immediately. The truck stopped right there. Then everyone started firing, ta-ta-ta, like a hailstorm. I couldn't tell what was going on. Who was shooting who? I fired again and killed the driver. The soldier next to him got away. I fell down and he nearly shot me. When I got up to the truck, he ran behind it. When I went this way, he ran the other way. Then I looked underneath the truck and could see him waiting. His feet were facing the other direction. So I quickly went around and shot him in the back.
The Mustang Force continued its operations until early 1969, when the CIA abruptly announced that it was cutting off all support to the resistance. America's foreign policy objectives had changed.
It was a different era. I think they pulled out of Mustang because of basically the operational utility was no longer there. It was pulling out of support for His Holiness, and then it was, you know, we were starting rapprochement with China, and it was a new, if not made at direct Chinese request, it was the U.S. relations with Tibet were something that would be certainly considered by that time to be somewhat of an impediment to relations, to the close relationship that the government was trying to initiate with Beijing.
The CIA told me, and the Chinese government made a condition to enable for United States to establish diplomatic relations with China. They made a condition, two conditions. One, United States must cut off their diplomatic relationship with Republic of China, Taiwan. Second, United States must cut off all the connections and all assistance for the Tibetans, including Mustang. But then politics are politics. You never know. Sooner or later they're going to betray you. Because Americans are giving me verbal assurances saying if Dalai Lama comes to India, they will support for India's Tibetan independence until Tibet regain independence.
I was very sad. It was really hard to announce the news to the soldiers. So for the time being, we decided not to inform the men about the cutoff. We sent a radio message to the Americans, telling them that they couldn't do this to us. Our first request was to ask them not to cut off aid immediately, but they said this was not possible, so there was nothing we could do.
Operations like this can't last forever. You either achieve your objective or you don't. And if you don't, you got to cut it and keep, and you know, make a clean cut and walk away. You might be able to, as you leave, give what somebody called a surge funding. You give an extra couple of the years' worth of funds and say, okay, here, we have to leave you. Goodbye, thank you for all you've done for us, and but this will keep you going for a little bit, and you know, find some other sources.
When all of a sudden the American government or CIA stopped our program, all of a sudden, then we felt a little bit, we've been deceived. We've been, this is what I felt also. And many of my colleagues, in Mustang felt. There was no, because I think our usefulness, we felt our usefulness to the CIS finished, which means they were only thinking for a short term, for their own personal gain, not for the long-term interest of the Tibetan people as such.
I don't know, these covert action operations and the U.S. government's interest in things is amazingly short. The lifespan of these things.
Well, it's dependent on which administration, too.
Well, but this one went through several.
Yeah.
There never was a really partisan issue on Tibet.
But as, I guess, a U.S. employee, that's still smart that we pulled out in the manner we did, in the same old way. Granted, in many other operations, we did it even less gracefully and more abruptly. Which
remember Beirut, you walk away from it, so it's a car wreck.
We can count them one after one after one after.
Look at the current one with the Kurds as far as that.
The survivors of the Mustang resistance force lived together in 2 refugee settlements in Nepal. Here they eke out a living spinning wool and weaving carpets. In 1974, the Nepalese government, under pressure from China, sent troops to Mustang to demand the surrender of the guerrillas. Fearing a bloody confrontation, the Dalai Lama himself intervened.
I was told they decide if Nepalese officials come to their place and take arms, then they decide to fight. So that's very serious. I think the few hundred Tibetan can stop some Nepalese people there for a few months. But what use? Then several thousand Tibetans in Nepal, they will suffer. So therefore, there's no other alternative except my direct sort of involvement. Then I said the message.
It contained his real voice. So when the Dalai Lama's message came, some of the men even cried, I swear. Everyone heard the message with their own ears, so we had no choice but to surrender. Then we turned in our weapons all day and all night.
Then one of our leaders, Genpache, said, "It is better for me to die than to surrender my weapons." Even so, he did give them up. But afterwards, he cut his own throat with a dagger and killed himself right there. Another soldier, Sewan Gepo, drowned himself. 4 or 5 others also threw themselves in the river and killed themselves.
"40 years after the guerrillas first took up arms, their goal of a free Tibet is still a dream. Their homeland remains firmly under Chinese control.
I think it was the right thing to do, and I think it was helpful to both sides. Having said that, a case can be made that what you did was just stir up the pot and provoke the Chinese communists even more. Maybe the Tibetans who were leading the resistance felt that they were going to get more support than we were capable of giving them. And so they exposed themselves more. I don't know. My own feeling is that is not the case. I think the Chinese would do what the Chinese were going to do, regardless of what it was, and that the Tibetan resistance was going to do whatever it could do, regardless of us.
I think it was the right thing, because the Chinese were the enemies of our religion. We were giving up our lives for our religion, so it only could be of benefit to us. There can be no sin attached to that.
It's very hard ever to take a moral calculus to this kind of thing. I mean, there were human lives lost in this. And I have no answer to that. I suppose everybody, likes to look back and try and justify what he did. I think I made some mistakes. I think I misunderstood, misappreciated, and didn't understand completely the whole complexities of the thing. But all I can say is my intentions were good.
Now, regarding the American support that we received, whether they did it with good intentions or whether they simply used us, we were able to utilize their help for our own ends. Nobody was interested in us. We couldn't just go and fight the Chinese with empty hands or with stones. We needed someone to come to our aid. In my opinion, I don't see our armed struggle as something that was helpful only at a certain point in our history, something that is finished. I believe we should look at it as one chapter in our continuing struggle for freedom, one that still has some meaning.
Unfortunately, our history as a government has more sad stories and sad endings than it does have good stories with good endings. Generally speaking, I think the agency looks at Tibet as having been one of the best operations that the agency has run. Well, that's fine. That's very complimentary. But however, look at the final results. Excuse me. That's a very sad commentary. If we look at what we did to Tibet as about the best that we could do, then I say that we have failed miserably.